The ruling by Britain's highest court that the suspension of the UK Parliament wasn't legal saw a brief bounce for the pound sterling. It rallied to almost $1.25 as traders considered the possibility that Britain could avoid a no-deal Brexit on October the 31st. Speaking to reporters in New York, where he's attending the UN General Assembly, Mr. Johnson said that he'll respect the Supreme Court ruling.
Obviously, this is a verdict that we will respect, and we respect the judicial process. I have to say I strongly disagree with what the justices have found. I don't think that it's right, but we will go ahead and, of course, Parliament will come back. I do think there's a good case for getting on with a Queen's speech anyway, and we'll do that. But I think the most important thing is we get on and deliver Brexit on October the 31st.
Now, to delve more into the implications of this ruling, we're speaking now to Professor Charles Lees. He's the Dean at the College of Business, Government and Law at Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia. Professor Lees, this was a stunning blow dealt to Prime Minister Johnson, not the outcome that he would have wanted. He said he doesn't agree with it. Does it now prolong the constitutional political crisis in the UK?
It doesn't necessarily prolong the crisis, but it certainly makes it more complicated. It deepens it in many ways. It brings the judiciary into a kind of collision course with the executive in a way that's not really the norm in UK politics, where the executive tends to have a stronger role than in some other countries. And it also puts the monarchy in a very difficult situation because, in a sense, the court has ruled that Boris Johnson has advised the Queen to essentially approve an unlawful measure.
So what do you think is going to happen next then for the Prime Minister in particular after this decision? Is an election inevitable?
Well, the Prime Minister is a risk taker, so it's always a little bit rash to make sort of really strong predictions, but I think an election is inevitable. It's the most likely outcome, but the real question is whether it's going to take place before or after the 31st of October, so the nominal Brexit deadline that's coming up next month. If the election takes place before that time, it is even possible that, given the opinion polls, that Johnson might win and then crash out with a no-deal Brexit. What the opposition parties will be hoping to do is to essentially delay any election to the point where Johnson has to go to the country having effectively broken his promise to bring about Brexit, do or die, and has had to go to the EU and ask for an extension. If he then has to fight an election on those terms, he's in a considerably weaker position, although he will obviously be tempted to ramp up the rhetoric and fight an election on the basis of the people versus Parliament. And that brings us into some very, very dangerous waters for the UK political system and for the Constitution, a real test of how strong that Constitution is.
And on that note, Professor Lees, what about the effect that this ruling has on Britain's government, what it means for the separation of powers in the UK between the head of state, Parliament, as well as the judiciary?
Well, the UK is, in many ways, not on paper a kind of pure democracy in the sense that the United States is, with the separation of powers between the various branches of government. The UK has a constitution which is obviously unwritten, but also, in a sense, is a sort of form of almost pre-modern constitution in many ways, in the sense that executive power is a kind of delegated monarchical power. So in many ways, that's meant, in terms of the operation of British politics, that the executive has been relatively strong vis-à-vis the other branches of government. Now, what we've seen in recent years, in the last 10 years, is a reassertion of the role of Parliament, which has always been a contested one vis-à-vis the monarch or the executive. I mean, we fought a civil war about this some centuries ago, but we've seen a reassertion of parliamentary assertiveness within the political process. And what this new ruling does is quite interesting, because it also seems to signal a more assertive role for the judiciary. So I guess the key question is this a one-off ruling by the justices in the Supreme Court when confronted by such an audacious and, in a sense, almost unprecedented move by the executive under Boris Johnson to prorogue Parliament in these circumstances? Or is this a harbinger of a new, more assertive Supreme Court? If that's the case, then we increasingly will find a sort of more triangulated form of government with Parliament and the executive and the judiciary all, in a sense, vying for attention within the political process. So I guess the key variable is what the executive does next. Boris Johnson, as I said, is a risk taker, and he's not afraid to use the full powers of the executive as given to him under the unwritten British Constitution to drive through Brexit, and in doing so reassert the role of the executive over the other branches of government.